Welcome to this video on changes in the 6th edition of the Golf Croquet Rules. At first glance it might look as if there are a lot of changes, but many of them are for clarification. Two things that will help make things clearer are the Glossary and the Index. The Glossary has been made much more comprehensive, and I'm sure you'll agree that the Index is a welcome addition. There are a few real differences, and that's what I want to concentrate on here. To get the most out of this video, you should have already read the new rules, or at least have a copy at hand so that you can pause the video from time to time to refer to the relevant rule. A copy of the 6th edition Golf Croquet Rules is available from the World Croquet Federation. Go to the following website and click on the link to the rules. I'll begin with the start of the game, which is covered in Rule 5. Instead of saying that the side that wins the toss plays first with the blue balls, the rules say that the side that wins the toss can choose whether to play first or second. If they choose to go second, then they play with the red and yellow balls. In the 5th edition there were rules that dealt with wrong balls and faults differently if they occurred in one of the first 4 turns. Those rules have been done away with. The same rules covering wrong balls and faults apply throughout the game. Next we'll look at Rule 6, which covers the turn, striking period and stroke. There has been a slight change to the definition of the striking period. It now says that the striking period starts when a player has taken a stance rather than takes a stance. The change makes it clear that accidental contact with the ball while in the process of taking a stance is not a fault. Annulment or cancellation of a stroke. I want to talk about an important difference between, on the one hand, replacing balls and cancelling a point, and on the other hand, the complete annulment of a stroke. Let's look at an example. Suppose a fault was committed with the blue ball but not noticed at first, and the yellow ball was played next, and that wrong ball was noticed, and black and blue chose replace and replay, and the balls were put back. But before the stroke was replayed, the earlier fault was noticed. That earlier fault cannot be dealt with, because the opponents have played a stroke since. Likewise, if the playing of blue had been a wrong ball, it could not be dealt with. Although the balls are back where they were before the stroke was played with the yellow ball, and any hoops would have been cancelled, the stroke itself is not cancelled. It is still considered to have been played. In the 5th edition, the only rule that deliberately cancelled the stroke was Rule 13, covering playing after play has been forestalled. The wording of Rule 13 has been changed to say the stroke is annulled instead of the stroke is cancelled. Let's look at a similar situation where Rule 13 would apply. Again, suppose that the fault committed with the blue ball was not noticed, but in this case, play was forestalled before the yellow ball was played, but that ball was played anyway. It does not matter why play was forestalled, as long as it was justifiably forestalled. The stroke with the yellow ball would be annulled. If the fault with the blue ball was noticed now, it could be dealt with because it would be treated as the last stroke played. Stroke annulment is now used to deal with some other situations, not just Rule 13. Here is a list of other rules that use stroke annulment as a remedy. Side playing when not entitled, which is covered under wrong ball play. Penalties for contravening Rule 16, covered under behaviour, and some situations covered under handicap play. These are playing extra strokes when not having any, playing an extra stroke that you have but at a time when not allowed, and playing by ignoring a warning by the other side about an extra stroke. Rule 6.3.6 explains how stroke annulment works in general within the Golf Croquet Rules. There are a couple of other changes relating to strokes. Let's look at them. When a ball that has become an outside agency ceases to be one. The rules used to say that a ball remains an outside agency until next played into the game. This has been changed to a ball ceases to be an outside agency at the start of the striking period of the stroke in which it's next played. For most situations the difference is not important, but it does make things clearer. Playing when balls are misplaced. I use the term misplaced ball to refer to a ball that's not in its correct position. The rules say that both sides are responsible for ensuring that all balls are correctly positioned before a stroke is played. That is, except for a ball that's an outside agency if it will not be played in the next stroke and both sides reasonably believe it would not be affected by the next stroke if it were in its lawful position. The rule also says that there is no remedy if a ball, including a ball that's an outside agency, is played from an incorrect position. The phrase there is no remedy means that if a ball is played from an incorrect position, the stroke stands. That is regardless of whether the ball was played from inside or outside the court or from the wrong place on the boundary. These two rules take precedence over this, and the stroke would not stand if the ball had been directed to be played from a penalty area or could still be directed. In that case, the ball would have to be played from the appropriate penalty area unless the offside opponent chose for the stroke to stand, or if Rule 13 applied, that is, playing after play has been forestalled. If a misplaced ball is affected by subsequent play other than by being played in a stroke, then, if the misplaced ball was an outside agency, apply the interference rule, except that the misplaced ball is put in its correct position rather than where it was when it was affected. There is also a rule covering the even more unlikely situation where the misplaced ball was not an outside agency when it was affected by subsequent play. Rule 7. Scoring a point. The terminology has been changed from saying something like breaks the plane of the playing side to first protrudes out of the jaws of the hoop on the playing side. However, there's little change to the rules covering running the hoop in order or a ball going through the hoop in order from the non-playing side, and no change to when a hoop becomes the next hoop in order. The only difference is if it's borderline and you can't tell whether the ball has run the hoop, rule it as having run the hoop. And if it's borderline having come from the back and you can't tell whether it's in a position to run the hoop, rule it as being in a position to run the hoop. Hoop contested out of order. Some people think it strange that there are different rules covering wrong hoops depending on whether the mistake is discovered by the players or a referee, but it makes perfect sense. If a player realises that they are competing for the wrong hoop, there's nothing wrong with them simply playing towards the correct hoop. And it would be okay to wait until after their next turn before doing anything to alert the opposing side. But what if neither side realised their mistake? To avoid time being wasted as players fruitlessly compete for one or more wrong hoops, a referee is allowed to intervene, but they need to intervene in such a way that the timing of their intervention does not give either side an unfair advantage. This is achieved with the penalty area continuation. We have reverted to the pre-2013 way of dealing with the wrong hoop situation if discovered by the players. That is, if players discover for themselves that they have contested a hoop out of order or run one or more hoops out of order, play continues by competing for the correct hoop from where the balls lie. The penalty area continuation has been retained for when the situation is discovered by a referee. Since the penalty area continuation treats both sides equally fairly, there's no need to wait for a hoop to be run before applying it. However, there are a couple of safeguards so that the referee does not intervene unnecessarily or prematurely. Rule 15.4 says, subject to Rule 7.9.2, if a referee observes that both sides have contested a hoop out of order in their respective last strokes, the referee is to forestall play and direct that play is to continue with a penalty area continuation. Saying subject to Rule 7.9.2 tells a referee not to apply the penalty area continuation if the players appear to have discovered the mistake themselves, and the requirement that the referee must have observed that both sides have contested a hoop out of order in their respective last strokes is so that, before intervening, the referee is reasonably sure that both sides do not realise that they are contesting the wrong hoop. Regardless of who noticed the mistake, hoops run out of order do not count, and misplaced scoring clips must be removed. Rule 8. Offside balls. A stationary ball that suffers interference close to a halfway line. If a stationary ball on or close to a halfway line suffers interference from the opposing side or an outside agency, and its position relative to the halfway line was uncertain before the interference, it's replaced as accurately as possible but will not be treated as an offside ball if a point is scored before it's next played. Other than that, there are no material changes to Rule 8. Rule 9. Interference. Relief from a fixed obstacle or uneven ground outside the court. If a player intends to hit another ball away and wants relief, the target ball is to be moved to if it's within 6 yards of the original position of the ball being played, subject to the consent of the owner of the target ball. Now, any ball that might be affected by the stroke, not just the target ball, is covered by this rule. Interference by incorrect information. The rule which covers acting on incorrect information given by the opposing side has been moved from Rule 15 to Rule 9. Since it's now treated as interference, time can be restored for it in a time-limited game under Rule 19. Rule 10. Playing a wrong ball. Rule 10 has been reorganised with the intention of making it easier to understand and use. Some wrong ball rules have been changed or deleted. The rule covering wrong ball in the first 4 strokes of a game has been deleted, so now the same set of wrong ball rules apply throughout the game. There are now 3 classes of wrong ball rule, namely Rule 10.3, playing when not entitled, Rule 10.4, previous stroke played with an opponent ball, and Rule 10.5, wrong ball played by the striker's side. Let's look briefly at each of those. Playing when not entitled. Rule 10.3 covers situations where the same side plays successive strokes, as well as some other situations where a side plays when it was not entitled to play. The remedy is now annulment of the stroke. It's possible that a sequence of strokes would need to be annulled, but in practice that would be very rare. On the few occasions when Rule 10.3 would apply, it would almost always be the case that only the last stroke would need to be annulled, and the previous stroke, which would then be treated as the last stroke, would usually be a lawful stroke. It would simply be a case of putting the balls back where they were and allowing the correct player to play the correct ball. But here is how Rule 10.3 would deal with the following very unlikely situation. Blue played blue, and the opposing side then played the yellow ball 4 times in a row. Assuming none of the strokes were extra strokes or replayed because of wrong ball or interference, the last 3 strokes would be annulled. After restoring the game to the point before the earliest of those 3 strokes, the first stroke played with the yellow ball would be treated as the last stroke played. Although that first stroke played by red and yellow was a wrong ball, the side was entitled to play a stroke at that time, so the stroke would not be annulled. In this case, it would mean that blue and black would have the choice of replace and replay or ball swap. In addition to covering situations where the same side played successive strokes, Rule 10.3 covers the following situations where a side played a stroke. In the first stroke of a game when the other side should have played it, or when the other side should have replayed a stroke due to interference or a wrong ball, or the other side was to play an extra stroke in a handicap game. So it covers quite a few different situations, but all of them are fairly rare. Previous stroke played with opponent ball. The remedy is the same as for the equivalent rule in the 5th edition, that is, the penalty area continuation applies. Wrong ball played by the striker's side. Again, the situations and remedies are the same as for the equivalent rules in the 5th edition. That is, the choice of ball swap or replace and replay if the partner ball was played, and just replace and replay if a different ball was played. Although the most common wrong ball situations are covered by Rule 10.5, when dealing with a wrong ball situation, it's best to check which rule applies in the order Rule 10.3, then 10.4, and then 10.5. Rules 11 to 13. There are no real changes in Rules 11 to 13, which cover false overlapping play and playing when forestalled. I mentioned that the rule covering acting on incorrect information from an opponent has been moved to Rule 9, interference. Other than that, there are no real changes to Rule 14. Refereeing. Impasses. Rule 15.3 has been introduced to deal with the situation, called an impasse, where the game is not progressing because all 4 balls are repeatedly declared as having been played, or effectively declared. Note that the impasse rule should not be applied in a situation where only 2 balls are being declared, while the other 2 balls are competing for the hoop. Hoop contested or run out of order. It may be necessary for a referee to intervene in the situation to avoid time being wasted by players competing for a wrong hoop. Rule 15.4 tells the referee how to do that. We looked at this earlier. Rule 16, behaviour. There is a new rule dealing with deliberate failure to forestall after playing a wrong ball and playing a stroke. The stroke played after such an offence can be annulled. Serious behaviour offences. The powers for dealing with a serious behaviour offence have been expanded slightly. Rule 18, alternative colours and double banking. There are no significant changes to the rule itself. It still says that a ball becomes an outside agency if it's moved to avoid interference to another game. Rule 19, time-limited games. Rule 19 is new. It claims to reflect standard practice, but that is only partly true. Reflecting standard practice is difficult since standard practice is different in different countries. The rule deals with this by having a default approach, which can be varied or replaced by organising bodies. Outline of Rule 19.1. The rule says how to decide if a stroke was played before time expired. It usually requires that the ball played was struck by the mallet before time expired. Rule 6.3.1 defines when a stroke is played. If a stroke played before time expired is to be replayed, but time expires before it can be replayed, the replay is treated as having been played before time expired. That is so, whatever the reason for the replay. The rule also says what happens after the last stroke played before time expired. Unless scores are level, the game ends immediately or after an extension period. Although a tournament organiser may specify a different resolution in their tournament regulations if they wish. What happens should be specified in the event regulations, but if they haven't been, then the defaults are there's an extension period of 2 turns for each ball, and play continues if scores are level, unless it's been stated that ties are allowed. Extension periods are rarely used in Australia for golf croquet, so the ACA tournament regulations will need to clearly specify the defaults appropriate for Australia. The rules dealing with restoration and suspension of time in time-limited games are more detailed than in the 5th edition, but I'm not going to look at those details here. Rule 20, handicap play. Playing extra strokes unlawfully. If a player plays an extra stroke, either when they do not have one to take or in the next stroke after playing a wrong ball, then, if players forestall before the opposing side has played a stroke, any such stroke is annulled. But if play is not forestalled in time, there is no remedy and any such extra stroke is treated as lawful. Communication with the opposing side. The warning that an extra stroke might be played is to be given before the opposing side plays a stroke. This is not a change in meaning of the rule, it's a clarification which was felt necessary because many players misunderstood the phrase immediately after in the old rules. After a fault. A player may still take an extra stroke after committing a fault. The non-offender now has the same rights after the fault as when an extra stroke is not taken. That is, they may choose whether the balls are replaced or left where they stopped after the fault, and the offender may require the non-offender to make their choice about replacement before the offender makes their choice about whether to take the extra stroke. Time-limited games. When can extra strokes be taken after time has expired? If play is to stop at the end of the final turn but scores are level and a tie is not allowed, extra strokes can be taken as normal. Extra strokes may not be taken during the extension period if there is one, but if scores are level at the end of that period and a tie is not allowed, extra strokes can be taken. Rule 21 is new. An advantage game is played to allow sides of different playing abilities to compete with more equal chances of winning by altering the starting score for each side. Each side seeks to achieve the same target score after taking into account its starting score. The address on the screen gives more detail. That link is also in the rules book. Advantage play is not intended to replace handicap play. It just gives you an alternative. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, you can email me at either of these addresses.